Hello, everybody. To everyone who's here in the room, everyone who's at home, online, or wherever you are, thank you for joining us. This is a part of Humanities Week here at ASU to celebrate and explore the entirety of the human experience and all of its variety and infinite diversity. And so this is, in that spirit, I want to present a very large scope, kind of longue durée view of Jewish travel and Jewish travel literature from the early Middle Ages through to the 18th century. And in the 18th century, I will kind of stop and focus on one specific traveler. And I'm very interested that is the Chida, known in religious and in rabbinic tradition as Chaim Nusaf, as the Chida, and his acronym, the Chaim Nusaf David Azulai is his name. And I want to look and explore some of the ways he encountered other Jews. And that's what I mean by diasporic self-discovery, how Jews are sort of seeing themselves in their own ethnic variety around the world. And that's one of the great yields of travel literature. All right, so let's talk about, I just briefly, I'll mention some travelers of the early Middle Ages that did not necessarily leave literature for us to investigate, but who are nevertheless travelers, Jewish travelers who are mentioned in other texts from the early Middle Ages. And at the end, I think I'll try to put this all together, why we're focusing on such a longue durée picture, and what's the relevance of this Hebrew travel literature. Not all of it is Hebrew, some of it's Judeo-Arabic, as we'll see in a minute. But one very early person in the late 8th century is Isaac the Jew, mentioned in Carolingian texts as being an ambassador for the Carolingians sent to the Abbasid world. He was sent among two other envoys. It was an envoy of 3 to the Abbasid world. Hey, Patrick, that's pretty good. And then he was the only one to return with an elephant. In fact, Einhard, the court historian for Charlemagne, confirms that there was an elephant in the menagerie of Charlemagne named Abul Abbas. So it kind of supports a little bit than this kind of like this little clip of a narrative of Isaac the Jew traveling to as an emissary between the Carolingian and the Abbasid world. A very interesting and important group of Jews, of Jewish traders, are the Radhanites. There's a lot of disagreement about where exactly they originate from. I think the thinking now is that, at least according to Moshe Gil, is that they actually originate in Baghdad, and that's the name. Like it seems to refer to a province, like a district of Baghdad. But that's not exactly how Ibn Khaldun describes it. In the way he describes the Radhanites, he's an Abbasid geographer. They always start in sort of Frankish lands, but really the Radhanites are broken down to four big routes of trade. Some that lead through the land of the Khazars and like the north of the Caspian Sea into modern day Russia and Kazakhstan. Others went through like Egyptian routes down to the Red Sea, to Jeddah, and on to India and to China. Others, the Radhanites would trade into Spain and Central Europe back into Baghdad. So really, like the Radhanites were on these 4 different routes. We don't know how it was arranged, but Jewish travelers in the 9th century, traders and slaves and weaponry too. They were trading slaves and weapons from the west for silks and spices from the east. More or less, Ibn Khaldun actually describes what they trade in, and so, but it's hard to see them as cohesive, right? It's more likely that they were sort of internally along these different routes, organized, and that there wasn't like a grand cohesion for all the Radhanites and all these routes, but they are really important global travelers, and they had commands of many languages. And then the last sort of travel I'll mention that comes up in other texts is Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Yisraeli, who is mentioned in a Cordovan text, so an Al-Andalus. So the Islamic, the Arabic text from Spain refers to him as having gone from Spain, and he's traveling through Central Europe, and he gives actually the very first description of Prague and the very first description of Krakow. And so he mentions these cities, and he's also very interested in the slave trade. So he always tells you how many slaves, what slaves are being traded. So it's possible, although not certain, that he himself might have been involved in the slave trade in Central Europe. So that's another Jewish traveler that pops up. I think it also, like, there's interesting questions to ask, like, what is travel literature? What can count as travel literature? So I think we have a good example right here, which is like you're seeing the Crescus map. This is a very famous image that you see. And the imagery wasn't made by Avram Kreskes himself, but the map was. So in 1375. So here's a map of the world made by a Jew in Spain. That also is a kind of travel literature in and of itself. This map. So I mean, I think that I just want to set the seeds that we're going to have a pretty expansive view of what travel literature is. Yeah. Yes. Say.
Flip the slide.
I don't understand what you're saying.
The map is not on the.
I'm not showing a map. Yeah. Okay. I'm showing an image from a map. This is the Kreskes map is very heavily illustrated, and this is one part of that. Also, like just to kind of challenge what is travel literature a little bit, and you have these snippets from the Geniza. And like you have these little like travel narratives, letters that go back from the Cairo Geniza, and they're all in this Cairo Geniza, letters from travelers back to their family. This in itself is a type of travel literature, but you see are these little snippets. Oh, right, these little snippets of texts that come from the Cairo Geniza. And interestingly, just to weave this together with travel literature in general, the Cairo Geniza itself is very much embedded in the history of Jewish travel literature, because the very first mention of it within Jewish circles comes from Yaakov Sapir in his essential text, the Evan Sapir, the Sapir stone. That comes from the 1880s, but he was traveling through India into Australia, all around the Eastern world. So it's really so. There's another kind of travel literature dimension even to understanding the Geniza. Okay, now I want to list for you, because the Jewish travel literature in the Middle Ages, early modern period is extensive. I would argue that Jews produced more travel literature in the Middle Ages, early modern period, than any other group on earth, including Abbasids in Baghdad. Jews produce extensive travel literature. And so this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination, but I've given you some like key texts I think fit into this category. And I'll just mention three of them. I've highlighted the ones I wanted to mention briefly. Obviously, most important, Benjamin Metudela. He's sort of the originator of all of this. He traveled from Spain. Here you see his itinerary more or less laid out. The red line is his way out, and the blue line is his way back. That's the idea. He also describes in his travel log even Samarkand in Uzbekistan, which he did not go to. And he's very clear about that. In the travel, there's a lot of debate about where he actually went and what he's describing, but if you actually read his travel log, he will tell you that I've heard that it's this many days from this place to that place, or I've heard that there are this many Jews here in Samarkand or something. So he's also, like a lot of this travel literature, bringing reports together. But really, Benjamin Metudela is the most extensive of travel of all medieval travel literature. Ironically, the funny thing is that we don't have an original manuscript of Tudela. All of the manuscripts come from the late 15th century and early 15th century. I'll show you some here. Here's like a 18th century copy. Here you can see the Sefer Hamasaot Shel Rebbe Binyamin. They're always called rabbis. I don't know why. That's an interesting thing on itself. But here you can kind of see it, a late version. Here's one of his Masaot, the travels, that are translated into Latin in 1633. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. Another one I want to point out is and by the way, I've been very careful to give you the titles of these as they appear in the text, because I think that that's important, what they call it. And sometimes they'll call them Sefer Masaot, like the book of travels. Or in this case, it's Hatzipor, the story of Petachia Miregensburg. Or you also see a Latinized Ratisbon. So sometimes you'll see Petachia Miratisbon. But I think that's a really important one too, because it's as extensive as Benjamin Metudela, or almost as extensive, but it's coming from an Ashkenazi perspective, so from Central European traveler, rather than a Sephardi perspective. And fascinatingly enough, and to me this is amazing, and I hope it is to you too, this text of Petachia Regensburg was put together. It seemed to be a collection of notes that was aggregated together by none other than Yehuda HaChassid, the founder of Chassidei Ashkenaz in the 12th century in German lands. So that means like this text was like rolled into a pietistic movement as well, as part of a major pietistic movement in Central Europe at the time. And you can see that in this text. Like, unlike Tudela, he's interested in like how many Jews live here, how many Jews live there, how long is it from here. You do get some magical elements in it and other things, but I'll refer to those in a second. But Ptachem the Regensburg, there's actually more magical elements, but he's much more pious. Like the Jews in this land keep the Torah in their perfection, or the Jews in this land, observe the laws of the Torah, so and so forth. So there's a deeper kind of piety element. And to me, it's fascinating that a movement like Hasidei Ashkenaz kind of had travel literatures embedded in it. And then obviously we can talk about all of these. I mean, the Sefer Tachkemoni is absolutely amazing. There's not time to talk about it. But the other one I'll mention is the Egeret Shilchoto of Yaakov Miperes. So the emissarial letter. So what happened after 1240, there was a disputation about the Talmud in Paris. It resulted with a Jewish convert to Christianity, Nicholas Donin, was debating a Jewish interlocutor, Yechiel Miperes. And at the end of it, 2 years after the close of this disputation, the Talmud was burned. Cartloads of the Talmud were burned in Paris. And Yechiel Miperes did not feel safe to live there anymore, so he made a migration to what was then Mamluk, or still Ayyubid, the Ayyubid Palestine. And there he established an academy in Akko. And this is the start of like a major migration movement after the Ayyubids take control, after the fall of the Third Crusade. There's a sustained migration movement of Jews from Europe to what they call the land of Israel, to Ayyubid and later Mamluk Palestine. In the hundreds, the speculation is about at least 300 Provençal Jews pick up and go to the academy in Akko. So there is. This is the 13th century. Also in the 13th century in Europe, things are really shifting against the Jews. Like there's a reactionary movement in the 13th century that's also pushing a lot of Jews out and what people want to leave. And you have people like, let's say, Yehuda Halevi in the 12th century who writes his Shirei LeZion, like his songs of Zion. His heart is broken and his body is hurting and aching to live in the land of Zion. And he does pick up and he leaves, and that becomes the subject of mythology too. So there are these kind of migration movements that are connected. So we looked at this. Here's a version of Ptachem Regensburg, I think. Hold on, I can't see because it's the thing is blocking me. But sorry, I think that this is a version of. Is that what it says there? Ptachem Regensburg. I think
18th century.
Yeah. Okay, that's what that is. Okay. Okay, I move this. Let's talk a little bit then about early modern. Now I'm defining the early modernity as anywhere between like 1400 and 1800. In the Middle Ages, it's like between 400 and 1400. And then subdivisions within those categories, and that's how I'm thinking about this too. And you can see in the early modern period, travel literature has an explosion. A lot of it is really rooted in like earlier travel literature. So, for instance, David Roveni, who you see in the 16th century up here, he's a Messiah traveler. He's claiming to have a messianic role. He's claiming to be from the 10 lost tribes, from the land of Havur and some beyond this magical river, the Sambation River that's made of stone, and then it flows 6 days a week, but on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, it doesn't flow. So this is obviously doesn't exist on Earth, but like those stories are drawn from an earlier text from the 9th century, El Dahadani, who was also making similar claims about where the lost tribes are, how to find them on Earth. These are kind of like literary claims, right? These aren't actual travels, but these are literary claims. But you can see the continuity of these medieval things. One thing that you don't see a continuity of is by the time you're in the early modern period, the kind of magical wonders are sort of out of the picture. So in the Middle Ages, you still have, people are still really rooting their travel literature on like the Alexander Romance of the 3rd century, the Ptolemaic 3rd century. And so you have people without heads and like people with tails and like people who hibernate 6 months of the year, like things like that, things that don't actually exist. That's ubiquitous almost throughout all travel literature. In fact, Ptachem the Regensburg, such a pious text, has the most magical elements in it. So I mean, it's that to me is kind of fascinating. And so by the time you're in the early modern period, there still is this messianic elements to it, like David or Roveni. But you also have more like fact finding. I mean, Benjamin Tudela was doing that too, but staking out where do Jews live, what are commercial networks, who is in power where, what are routes to the land of Israel, to what Jews call the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, and so on and so forth. I'll mention, I'll just drag out a couple of these. Abadja Mebartanura, it's a very famous travelogue, and I think it's really important because he also Mishum Volterra, these Italian travelers that go to what is Mamluk and then what becomes Ottoman Palestine, is that they are they're much more interested in like differences between people. They're very Avadia Bartanura especially is very careful to tell to explain who is who, where he goes. It's very ethnographic. So you're starting to get more ethnographic elements, true ethnographic elements. Like Benjamin Tudela doesn't really have any ethnography at all. It's just like there's this many Jews that live here. This is how many days from here. But now in the early modern period, I think there's more of an interest in ethnography. And I'll mention 1524, the Egeret Orchot Olam by Avram Farisal. Super cool text. This is travel literature, but not of a single traveler, single traveler. Avram Farisal aggregated all of the great travel literature that was coming into modern Europe at the time, into 16th century Europe. So he takes John Mandeville from the 13th century, or Marco Polo from the 13th century, Amerigo Vespucci from the 16th century, the Voyages of Columbus. All of these, I think Jean Delery even, like he takes all of these texts that are that travelers that are encountering the Americas and describing indigenous people in the Americas. All of that was felt by this Renaissance scholar in Ferrara, Avram Farisal, that needed to be available to a Hebrew-speaking audience. So he writes his Egeret Orchot Olam, the letter of the past of the world, to kind of aggregate all of that travel literature and that knowledge of the world into for a Hebrew reading audience. Here you can see, like I gotta break that habit. This is an example of the text of a Egeret Orchot Olam, and like what you're seeing right here is like you see Eretz Chadasha. This is the new world, and then here you have like a star chart that's supposed to. And he explains to you here. This is a star chart, tells you how to get to the Eretz Chadasha. So if you're trying to get to the new world, all you need is a copy of Farisal, and you can find your way. So I mean, it's really important that like even non-Jewish travel literature is sort of making its way into the Hebrew world because of that. I'll also mention the travels of Moshe Yerushalmi Mechevron. This is an interesting one. It's he is someone who's starting from Hebron in what is today the West Bank, and that's I think very interesting because it's going to set the stage for the person I really want to talk about when I get there, who is also leaving from Hebron but barely describes it. But there are a lot of descriptions of Hebron at the time. Hebron is really central in a lot of this travel literature. There's even a guy Hebroni who is probably an Ashkenazi Jew who migrates to Hebron in the 13th century, or maybe in the 14th century. So I just wanted to put that as a highlight because Hebron is going to become an important city for us as we go forward. And then I'll also mention Chaim Yitzhak Karikov, who sends letters from the Americas. This is another type of travel literature already that's coming up. This is the travel literature of Shlichim, or in what in like rabbinic Hebrew we call Shadarim, the Shlichut de Rabbana, like the emissaries from the Holy Land who are traveling around the world to try to collect funds for their academies. And this is why I wanted to mention the emissary of Yechiel Paris before from Akko, because that maybe starts this whole program of fundraising for academies that are in Palestine. So very much like Yitzhak Karigal fits in that model, and Azulai, who I'm going to talk about, fits in that model very well. But Chaim Yitzhak Karigal is interesting because he's in the Americas. He serves as a rabbi, in fact, in Jamaica, in Suriname, and he dies in Barbados. His tombstone's in Barbados. He goes to Newport, where he has this like kind of discussions with Ezra Stiles, and like Ezra Stiles, who's the founder of Yale, like recorded in his diary all of these discussions he has with Chaim Karigal, this foreign Oriental Jew, who's from Hebron, like born and grown up in Hebron in the 18th century, and travels the world. And we have these letters that have descriptions of Curacao and in Jamaica. So really interesting, very interesting character. And I'll just mention two more here that are super cool. and then we'll come back to Azalai. But the Maseh Ba'arav is a very interesting text. It's a play on words. I think it's meant to be like a homonym because it's Maseh spelled with a mem, sadi, mem sin, aleph, I think. So Maseh, but it's not travel with a samech and samech. It's with a sin. So it means like a burden or a travail or something. But I think it's a homonym. It's supposed to be like masa, travel. Anyway, so it's like a burden in the Arab land. And Shmuel Ramanelli, who's writing from the Maskilic perspective, from the like he is a Jewish Enlightenment figure from the 18th century in Italy. He's writing in a Hebrew that was now part of the Jewish Enlightenment revival of Hebrew, of secularization of Hebrew. And he travels to Morocco, and he has lots of very fascinating ethnographic descriptions, very like civilizationally condescending, I would say, condescending of like indigenous people or Jews, even Jews living in Tunisia, critical of the life of Jews in Tunisia. He's writing from this Enlightenment perspective. It's a super cool text, though, because he happens to be in Morocco during a time of persecution of Jews when several hundred Jews were like hung upside down in Meknes by a kind of psychotic sultan. It was sort of that's not characteristic of life of Jews in Morocco, but in this particular moment in 1791, there was this attack on Jews that resulted in a massacre that he was actually there to witness and write in his travel account, and it's very well corroborated, by the way, by Arabic texts. So what he writes in that text is well corroborated. And then the last one I'll mention in the early modern period is super fun, and that's the Igeret Meshulam by Isaac Eichel, Yitzchak Eichel, who is probably really the founder of the Enlightenment, of the Jewish Enlightenment, in Königsberg. He is the founder of the Chevre Lashon Eve, like the society of reinvigorating Hebrew and studying Hebrew in Königsberg. And he's the one who edits Hamasef, the journal in Hebrew of the Jewish Enlightenment figures in the late 18th century in Königsberg. And so in that publication of Ma'asef, the gathering, he includes this almost like Hebrew version of Montesquieu's Persian letters. It's an entire fiction. It's a complete fiction. But what the story is Meshulam, he doesn't come from Persia, but he comes from like in Persian letters, but he comes from the land of Israel, and he travels through Italy, and he travels to Königsberg. And in Königsberg, he's noticing how advanced the Jews of Europe had become, how they had touched secularism, how they had become acculturated, and he uses that as like as a pivot to criticize the backwardsness of traditional Jewish life. So it's a Maskilic propaganda, right? It's propaganda from the Enlightenment figures criticizing traditional Jewish life of being too sort of backwards and unsophisticated, and it's all done in sort of in this like Hebrew version of the Persian letters. It's also really funny. Like a lot of these texts are really funny. That one's really funny. Like think of some of the funny stories. Meshulam, like he doesn't understand certain things. He doesn't understand how people go to baths house and they come out smelling good, because like in things like there's a lot of kind of comedy in this one. There's a lot of comedy in Harizi. That's a really funny text if you can crack its rhyme version, but it's actually meant to be a comedy. Okay, so I just wanted to go through. Here's another interesting, there's also these sort of visualized representations of the land of Israel that you see, like the Kasali pilgrim. He's anonymous, but that's what Cecil Roth calls him. And you can see his illustration of Jerusalem. And he makes other illustrations of holy sites. Almost all of these guys mention things like the bit where the burial sites of biblical figures, or the Kotel, like the Western Wall and things like that. Okay, how am I doing, Lisa, with time?
About 25 minutes.
All right, I could do this. Okay, so that brings me to the guy I really want to talk about here, is Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the Chida. And this image, by the way, I don't know where it is. It's completely has no provenance. I've been completely unable to find where it is or who made it. I don't know if it even exists anymore. All the images of him are this copy of a copy of a copy, and I've got no clue where the original version is, or this is even him at all. But supposedly this is supposed to be a likeness of the Chida. So the Chida is also born and lives in Hebron, And he's one of these emissaries. He's a shaliach, shadar, whatever you want to call him, sent by the Hebron community to the communities of North Africa and of Europe. And there are other texts. He's not the first to do this, by the way. There are other texts of emissaries that also were writing about their travels before he did it. So he's not necessarily unique in writing about his travels. What makes him kind of unique in writing about his travels really is that he has two big volumes of it. You know, there's two different journeys. He has journey one, where you see here in the 50s, in the 1750s, where he's kind of traveling through Central Europe mostly, Italy, of course, and into London, and then back again. The blue line is sort of back again. And then you can see his second mission, his second mission in the 1770s, where he spends a lot more time in France, really, in the Netherlands. And I really want to pick out how he approaches other Jews. That's what's sort of interesting to me. And this is something that's a pattern in Jewish travel literature from the beginning. Like from the beginning, Jewish travel literature was trying to identify where and what and who are the Jews living in the world. Sometimes mythologically, like where are the 10 lost tribes? Where do they exist? You know, and so in his attempt to try to identify Jews, it's not exactly unique, but he does a lot of things. So he's an emissary from the Holy Land. The way that this works is in Istanbul, there is a body of Jewish authorities who kind of deal with Jewish life in the Ottoman world, and they have authority over Jewish life throughout the Ottoman world. They're called the Bekide Kushta. It's not so dissimilar, let's say, as the Vad Arba Artsot, the Council of the Four Lands that you see in Poland, Lithuania in this time, like an overarching body that governs Jewish life internally. And that's what the Bekide Kushta do in Constantinople. And they're the ones that sort of send out these emissaries. They're the ones that decide, you emissary are going to go collect money for this academy. So it's not like a personal decision. There's more of a collectivity to this mission. And again, there's hundreds of these guys. He's not alone in this. Now, he's one of the things that he's interested in his travel is to identify texts and books. What are the books out? What's available in the world? What books are out there? What's written about Jewish life and Jewish law? And so really in the first volume especially, and it carries through to the second volume, but in the first journey especially, he's very interested in the books he's finding. And you can see he has a companion, I can think of it as a companion text, but it's a text that stands alone too. It's a text that I actually use a lot. Like anyone who studies early modern Jewish history is going to need this text, because he has this text called Shem HaGedolim, the big names, or the big name, and what it means and what it is. It's a massive bibliography of all the books that he finds. So basically, it's like kind of a guide to what text existed in the 18th century. Thanks for that. So he was very interested in kind of meeting other rabbis, interested in finding books. He mediates in disputes, as all the shlichim do, because they have a special authority. They're outsiders, but they also carry the authority of the Holy Land with them. And they're all sort of, they carry these letters that speak to their bona fides as rabbinic scholars. And so they tend to be involved in a lot of communal disputes. When Jewish communities can't get it together, the shaliach will sometimes be the one to rule on an internal matter. Or if two rabbis in a community are disputing, he'll rule on that matter. So they play a very important role, actually. And there's a lot of these guys in the Americas too, not just Karigal, but Shmuel Cohen. There are others that make it to the Americas. Okay, so now what's interesting is that when you compare the first volume, the 50s travels, to the 70s travels, you can see that Europe has touched him a little bit. Like, he's been influenced by Europe, because I figured this out, and it's about 40% more secular interests in the 1770 ones than in the 1750 ones. So in the 1750 ones, there are some he'll mention, like, oh, I passed this garden, or I saw this monarch, or something like that. But then in the 1770s one, he actively seeks out like museums and cabinets of curiosity and menageries. He clearly becomes enamored with life in Europe, and he's sort of almost becoming more critical of the Sephardi world that he comes from, the Spanish Jewish world of the Mediterranean, where he's from. So that's one interesting thing. I think that's something to draw out from this travel log, how secular curiosities work themselves in. Another element of Azulai's travelogue that's fascinating to me is to maybe think about it in terms of what Yakov Katz, who was a scholar in the 50s, called a neutral society, if such a thing even exists. But what he meant by neutral society, he first used that term to describe Freemasons. And like Freemasonry was a neutral society because Jews could participate and other people participate. And then there's like, it's sort of above the fray of internal ethnic conflict. Even we can debate if that's true or not. But if there is a neutral society, I think travel offers us a lot of really fruitful avenues to think about neutral society. And look at Azulai's life. He spent tons of time at non-Jewish inns, staying with other non-Jews in inns. He spends tons of times on ships with non-Jews, right? Travel is itself a neutral society. He spends tons of time. He's in quarantine, I think, at least 3 times, 40 days each in quarantine in Livorno. So when you're in quarantine, because he's coming from North Africa, so when you're in quarantine, like you're there with everybody. Like there's not a special Jewish quarantine. So that's a sort of neutral society too. Humans carry the same pathogen. They obviously didn't know what pathogens were, but there's something that's kind of like transcendently human about the need to quarantine that produces perhaps a neutral society. He's traveling in wagons with non-Jews. However, as we'll see, he's so funny because he never differentiates non-Jews. Unlike the medieval travelers, like Meshulam Volterra especially is like this, or Ovadia me Bartanuro, they're very much like this. They are very careful to tell you the differences among the Latins, the Greeks, the Arabs. They'll tell you about the non-Jewish differences and the ethnic differences that they'll encounter. So medieval travel literature tends to be more like have a more sophisticated gaze on the world outside of the Jews. But in Azulai, there is none of that. If he's in France, if he's in Italy, they're not French, they're not German, they're not Italian, they're not English, they're Goyim. That's the term he uses, Goyim. They're just non-Jews, or Goyot, for Yisrael, or Goya, like a non-Jewish woman. So like he makes absolutely zero differentiation between, in his mind, like all non-Jews are just the same thing. But the Jewish world is incredibly diverse and full of all this variety. So the way he sees the Jewish world as being completely like full of all of these unknown types of Jewish life, but he says but he also just doesn't seem to care about non-Jewish differences. And I think that's interesting. Now, another element before we will look at some quotes at how he perceives other Jews, and this is what I mean by that diasporic self-discovery, like perceiving other Jews through your own lens, which is not exactly even what Azulai does, because in fact he sees it through the lens of the Portuguese Jews in Livorno, which he is not. He's a Sephardic Jew from Hebron, right? So it's a little bit different. So let me just tell you a little bit about Livorno, because Livorno is the linchpin of the entirety of all of his travels. He ends up dying there. His daughter lives there. He always goes through Livorno. He's always in quarantine in Livorno. And every one of his voyages, he ends up going back through Livorno on the Tyrrhenian side of Italy. That's the western coast of Italy. It's in Tuscany. So it's a city built by the Medici, like out of nothing. And then it was destroyed by the Allies. So it's not much there today because the Allies bombed it during World War II. But it was a city built in a marshland by the Medici to create a port. And to populate this port, they sent a special invitation to Portuguese Jews and conversos that if they come live in Livorno, there'll be no prosecution for the reversion to Judaism, having been conversos, which is a big thing in Italy because, like in 1556, the Pope massacred like 23 conversos who showed up in Ancona, and re-Judaized. So to have an invitation to come to Italy, having been Catholic, and then adopt an open Jewish identity, that was not something that was always available. But Livorno offered that, and in 1593, the Livornina, the charter, granted complete immunity, pretty much amnesty for the sin of Judaizing, which is what the sin is, of having been a converso and becoming a Jew again, and by religion, right? In the Livornino also this basically gave almost complete economic freedom to the Portuguese Jews. And over time, Livorno ends up being this incredible Portuguese-speaking city in Italy. And that's not so, there are Greek-speaking cities in Italy and in Calabria and things like that. But here, like, you have this Portuguese Jewish community of Livorno. And they end up becoming, for Ozolai, the model Jewish community. And he filters all of his other interactions with the Jewish community through the model of the Livornese. He loves their wealth. He's collecting money. Okay, that's his job. So he likes their wealth and their generosity. He likes the structure of the synagogues and the power structures. He likes how they're very learned. He describes the Portuguese Jews of Livorno, who had all been conversos, or second generation Jews, or first generation Jews. So it's amazing that he has this like respect for Portuguese Livorno. But he sees it as like they found the balance between like with Jewish piety and assimilation. Like they were able to acculturate without losing themselves. And Ozolai finds that praiseworthy, like how they're able to kind of go to the brink. Like in the 18th century, the Livornese Jews have their own casino. They can't go to non-Jewish casinos. So they have their own casino. And Ozolai doesn't seem bothered by that, So like it's he really thinks the Livornese community is as the absolute model Jewish city. Now, here you see a text. His handwriting is impossible to read. It's thank God, or not thank God, thank scholars that in the 20th century, like in 1908, Aaron Freiman made like a comprehensive edited version of it that you can actually read. That's sitting right there on the chair. So like, so if it was like this, this is like very, very hard to read his writing, for me at least. Okay, so here, I just want to break down, like, it's hard to draw direct quotes, but in aggregate or in holistically, this is how he kind of views other Jewish minorities, more or less. And there's a lot of room for discussion, or Jewish ethnic varieties. There's a lot of discussion if this is a true characterization, but this is how I'll present it, for a week. And obviously that I am open to varieties of ways of understanding him. But I think he's generally critical of the world he comes from. He sees like the Eastern Sephardi Mediterranean, so like Hebron and Jerusalem and Tiberias and where Jews are living, or even Istanbul as being, or Saloniki really, which is a huge Jewish city. We're talking about 25,000 to 30,000 Jews, so a massive city. In these places, he thinks that this is the height of where rabbinic learning is. But there's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of like buying of rabbinic offices, and he's like critical of like sort of the ethics of rabbinics in the Levantine world, but he thinks that he always praises them as the model of great Talmudic learning. He loves the Portuguese Jews of Livorno, I just said. Now the Maghrebi Jews of Tunisia, who he sees, and we'll look at an exact quote, are to him uncivilized, simplistic, superstitious, quarrelsome. Some of these are direct quotes, impoverished, but yet they have a good spirit. They're nice, you can see the civilizational. This is a guy from Hebron who's looking down on people from Tunisia, okay? Like he's coming from an impoverished city himself. And then in Tunisia, he sees these people as being sort of uncivilized. The Ashkenazi Jews of Central Europe and London, he has very little respect for. It's some specific rabbis, I've got 10 minutes. Yeah, so some specific rabbis in I think I can do this. In the Ashkenazi world, he does have a lot of respect for, and he'll meet like individuals who he praises. But in general, they're just like they're undisciplined in their prayer. They don't fully understand why they do things. Like they're so rigid in the Jewish law, but they don't have a full understanding of why the law exists or what the law is supposed to do. Like they're in Ozolai's mind, like Ashkenazim of Central Europe are just like mindless drones of the law without thinking about the law. The bad leadership structure, he doesn't raise any money there. They're miserly, they're kamsanim, they're quarrelsome, so on and so forth. And then the Portuguese Jews of France and Amsterdam, he loves their wealth, but and their communal structure, but they are overly assimilated and intermingled with non-Jews. We'll look at an example of this. There's too many violations of the law, especially Sabbath observance, and also shaving beards. This is something that Ozolai has no tolerance for, but the Portuguese Jews do. Like Portuguese Jews had all been Catholic at one point, and so they shave their beards, and so it's this, and they speak European languages. So he finds that really offensive to see Jews that don't wear Jewish men without beards. So violations of the law, business on Sabbath, loose sexual morality. We'll look at some of those. I'll show you a quote. And then the Italiano communities, he also does come in contact with the Romano community. There's others here. This is not a comprehensive list, but generally praises their generosity, but thinks that they don't fully comprehend the law that they're following. So everywhere he goes, he has a little bit of criticism for everybody. And let's look at some quotes maybe from the text to think of like how he sees other people in other places. So here's one from Tunisia, it was in Tunisia, from 1773. Women never sit down at the table, particularly in this matter of eating. They conduct themselves according to their own customs, and they eat with their hands and with their feet. Sure. And their hands become filled with greasy fat. The wealthy man would lift up a piece of fatty meat, and while holding it in his hand, he would swallow it and then wipe his hands on a towel on his knees. This towel would become greasy and bloody like a butcher's shop. Also, the men and the women walk barefoot. Okay, so like he obviously sees them as being uncivilized, as not being touched by the softer features of Western society, even though he doesn't belong to that society either. But he's raised Livorno up as this perfect model, so he's clearly filtering this through a Livornese lens. I'll have more to say about Livorno in a second. Here's another. This is my favorite thing from Azalai. I love this one, so I'll read this to you. Indeed, many times things happened to me in Tunis, for which God took pity on me and put the answer on my tongue, helped me to respond. One night, after midnight, after I had gone to bed and drawn the curtains, behold, I saw a man entering through the window toward me, and I was startled. He said, I am Moshe, son of Kayed, a local Jewish community leader. My father says that there are some Livornese Jews here who belong to the sect of Freemasons. Is it permitted to kill them? And this must be in secret. Answer me now. And when I heard this, Azalai, when I heard this, I jumped up in shock, and I said to him, you dare ask me the laws concerning capital punishment as I lie here in my bed? Away with you quickly, but I will tell you to tell your father that it's absolutely forbidden to kill them, even in an emergency, obviously. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. Like he's kind of indifferent about Freemasonry, but like the sense that like these are like kind of pious radicals here. Like their Judaism is one of like extremism, and not one of like rooted and thoughtful analysis of the law in the way that Azulai is. So that's another interesting thing. And I'll just circle back to Livorno here, because this also speaks to another really important reality, that the Portuguese Jews of Livorno are also establishing their own diaspora. From Livorno, they branch out to especially Algeria and Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, all throughout North Africa, and then to Syria, Aleppo, and into Iraq. And the Portuguese Jews of Livorno, Portuguese-speaking Jews, they do not call themselves Sephardi. And they establish this great network of mercantilism across the Arabic world. And this is that's exactly the context that's showing up in this little snippet here. These Livornese Freemasons that are in Tunisia, they're there because of this expansion, of this commercial expansion of the Livornese community. Okay, and then of course the Americas start to come into to play. I'm good. This is my last slide. Okay, so the Americas come into play several times in Azalai's narrative. In Bordeaux, he actually meets David Gratis. And he talks about meeting David Gratis. David Gratis was one of the biggest, he did have interest in the slave trade in the Atlantic world, but he's very interesting because he's one of the few, like Jews were expelled from the French Caribbean in 1685. And the first entry of the Code Noir expels Jews from the French Caribbean. So Jews got up from Guadeloupe, from Martinique, and from Saint-Domingue, and they left. But there were patents in the 18th century, patents given to big businessmen and traders to have interest in place in the island. So some Jews were living there, especially David Gratis' son, their business. So he was spread out from Bordeaux, and he had envoys in Saint-Domingue, in Haiti, like at the time of the revolution even. The French monarchy became dependent on him for shipping. So David Gratis is a huge, a very big personality in all of this. And he had interest in the Americas, of course, and Azulai meets him and describes meeting him as a very wealthy person, but devoid of learning. And he doesn't care about the Talmud. And here's another, he's in Amsterdam, and this speaks to another connection to the Americas. And here's Azulai getting angry again at what he sees. This son of a prominent rabbi, the son of a prominent rabbi, had been to America twice. And, there's a lot of typos here, I'm sorry. And he told me that he had found out that a guy that Azulai keeps anonymous had brought a mulatto from there, a mulatto woman, a mixed race woman, She was a Goya, so I just kept that term because that's how Azulai refers to non-Jews, just generally, as just non-Jews. Born from a black woman and a white man. And she became there's so many typos here, I'm sorry, his concubine and bore him a son. Even here in Amsterdam, these are shocking tidings. And about this guy, too, there were gossip that he had been involved with a woman, and there exist here candies with writing inside of adulterous and salacious material, which he possessed and had given out to people. So the guy was like walking around with his concubine and handing out candy with pornographic slogans on it or something. So like you can see like Azulai looking at these people, it's like these are, reflecting on himself, and he's critical of them. So I just think that he's a fascinating window into this very long process of Jewish travelers trying to see themselves reflected in other Jews. And trying to create an ethnographic sort of taxonomy of the Jewish world. And thank you very much for joining me today. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, 15 minutes, and I have one you start us off if you want.
Good deal.
Thank you.
Okay. Who supports these travels? Does the dominant culture / government encourage Jewish travelers to go forth and study other regions where Jewish people?
Well, in one case, in the case of Jacob the Jew, right, Jacob Judaeus, I'm sorry, he was sent as an envoy by the Carolingians. So in that case, this was an actual state travel. But in most cases, has nothing to do with the non-Jewish state. And but the non-Jewish states do support Jewish travel in some ways, especially that really important moment when Ayyubids take control around 210 or so. When the Ayyubids take over from the Crusaders. And this is another really interesting point about traveler. There's a sort of, it doesn't fit. This is a point that, I'm sorry, Ari. This is a point that what's his name? Martin Jacobs makes in his book, Reorienting the East, is that there's sort of an inverted Orientalism in these travelers, because especially in the 13th century, they're almost polemical against Christianity. And someone like Meshulam Volterra, Vadia Bartanudo, they were very interested in and portraying Islamic kingdoms as being tolerant and open to Jews, and Christian kingdoms as being persecutory and hateful. And in that, there's this inverted Orientalism, right? It's a kind of positive gaze onto the Oriental world and a critical gaze onto the Christian world. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the readership of these diaries and travel journals, because my understanding is at that time in the 18th century, most of the Jews spoke either Sephardic or Yiddish.
Totally.
So the Hebrew was spoken only by a minority, many religious people. So how did they reach the white leadership or the
That's a really good question.
many religious type of leaders?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. First of all, most of these are printed. Most of these are printed in the 16th century. And so that means that they were texts that really wanted to be read, like people wanted to read, and were texts that people thought needed to be circulated. They're almost all written in Hebrew. Again, the only exception to this, there is some Yiddish travel literature from the 18th century and from Amsterdam. So that the Asher Levi, I think, there is some of that, but most of it is Hebrew. And you're absolutely right. Hebrew is not a spoken language here, but it's still the literary language, and so they're writing it in Hebrew. But interestingly enough, Azulai, I just was looking at this before the lecture, and he'll go places and he'll mention I spoke to him in Hebrew, like he seeks out people that he can speak to in Hebrew. So that was interesting to me. But remember, he's living at the same time as Ramcha, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who's also writing plays in Hebrew and doing secular things in Hebrew, and the Maskilim are not far behind, who secularized Hebrew to a great extent. So I think in the 18th century, Hebrew is starting to secularize, and there is that, but still not being spoken yet. But still, clearly the literary language of the Jewish people is Hebrew, and that's why they're written in Hebrew.
Any other questions in the room?
Okay, there's one more online. Amidst these opinions of other Jewish regions, albeit positive and praiseful at times, it further relates the ions of generational anti-Semitism and translates and internalizes these observations.
through to contemporary times. Jewish identity from birth and on as the other throughout.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting observation. I think the idea here is that Ozolite might be internalizing I won't say anti-Semitic because it doesn't exist, that terminology, but like anti-Jewish or Judeophobic sentiments and the way he describes people. Yeah, I have a hard time kind of seeing that. Like Ozolite seems like he's very exposed to the non-Jewish world. Like he sees the French Dauphine, and like he goes to the libraries and he's at the biblioteca, like, and so he knows the non-Jewish world, but he seems rather disinterested in it. I don't know how much like the opinions of like non-Jewish opinions swayed the way he views the other Jews. In other words, it's very possible to have civilizational indignation against your own people without being informed by others, I guess is what I would say. Yeah.
See you tonight.
Right. Sorry, the people online need to be able to hear you.
He said that Israelite and wrote a lot about the concept of a neutral society.
Well, no, he didn't actually write about that. I'm sorry, just cut you off, but that's a concept from Jewish historiography that I was like applying to him. But I think you can argue that he lived a lot in a neutral society through quarantine, shipping, on ships and in inns and such, like things like that.
Okay, so pivoting off of that, what are the main traditions or authors that developed that concept and worked in that sort of sphere?
Yeah, the actual concept was promoted by Yaakov Katz in the 1950s, like a Jewish studies scholar. And then he took that idea, he wrote a book about Jews and Freemasonry, and that's where that comes from. But then you see the terminology showing up in his later works too, to describe like the Jewish process of modernity, that there are certain places where Jews can find belonging. Freemason being one of them. I think there may be some other examples. But there are places where you might think Jews would find belonging but don't, like casinos, where they're usually barred, but like Jews have to have their own casinos in Italy. So, it's a little... So I think we can debate how true the concept of a neutral society really is. Is there anything that really ever is a neutral society, really? I think that's might be an overly optimistic view of Yaakov Katz, but I do think it's a compelling historiographic model in which to think about travelers. That's all. That's kind of what I was saying. I don't know if I answered your question. But every other traveler here is existing in some space that was similar to what Ozolite experienced, that were places where Jews and non-Jews could kind of live together because they're not debating religion. They're just moving from one place to another.
Right.
Yeah.
Aria.
Yeah, I was wondering, so, what language, because I know some of these got translated into Hebrew later, but what was the primary language that these were being written in?
Hebrew. I mean, the primary language these are written in was Hebrew. Absolutely. These guys are writing in Hebrew. As far as I could tell, all the titles are Hebrew. And so, yeah, it's not that uncommon. I mean, like, especially in the early modern period, rabbis are writing in Hebrew only. And in the medieval period, rabbis who are philosophers can foray into other languages, but still rabbinics is always done in Hebrew. Mishnah Torah is in Hebrew. I mean, like, so, in a way, maybe you can imagine this as an extension of rabbinics. All of these guys, by the way, are have like a resh before their name. All of them. You telling me that so is that something about being a rabbi that you have to be itinerant, or what makes them rabbis per se? So that's a curious thing. But I think so. I do think that, like in the case of Batachia Regensburg, it's a good case. Like that, in that case, that was actually woven into a pietistic movement. So you can understand why Hebrew is embedded. Sefer Hasidim is in Hebrew. And that's written in the 12th century too. So yeah, my understanding is that apart from the Geniza fragments that are Judeo-Arabic, but they have some Hebrew in them too. But apart from the Judeo-Arabic ones and then the later Yiddish ones, these are. It's not like the philosophy works that are being it's not like a Saadia Gaon or Maimonides that are writing their philosophies in Arabic, right? These are just travel logs, so they're using Hebrew.
So, I mean, this might be a bit tangential, but then why is there this idea that Hebrew only got like reinvigorated as a language, or got like put into real use beyond liturgy, like the idea that that only came about in the 1800s.
with the revival of Zionism. Yeah, and well, I mean, there's a lot of truth. Though there's truth to that in the sense of like the spokenness of it. So like what Eliezer ben Yehuda did in the early 20th century is take this language that had existed as a literary language in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, and turn it into something that could be spoken as an everyday language to go buy eggs at the store. You know, something that was applicable to modern day life. That didn't exist in the early modern period. But in the early, and certainly not in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period, there is a process of secularization that is happening with Hebrew. And you can maybe see travel literature as a step in that. And maybe it's why in the process of secularization, they lean on travel, those who are doing the secularization lean on travel literature to do it. Someone like Isaac Eichel, why does he write Get It Meshulam in the way he does in this beautiful Hebrew? Because I mean, the Maskilim are only writing Hebrew. They're trying to revive Hebrew, not as a spoken language, but as the literary language of the Jews. And also, and I mentioned before, but Ramchal in Italy and then later in Amsterdam at the same time is also, having Hebrew revival efforts. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference between the literary usage of the language and then the spoken usage. That's maybe my understanding of that. Yeah.
Thanks. There is one part I don't know if I missed, but can you say something about traveling during the Inquisition with the Carvajal and
Luis de Carvajal, sure. Yeah, that's an interesting text.
so its choice of displacement and so on?
Yeah, it's I love thinking about what could be travel log. Like I think like the letters of Joseph, the king, the Khazars to Chastai bin Shaprut in the 10th century, like that's a kind of travel literature too. Like he describes how to get places. So I think you can expand and like let's say the autobiography of Luis de Carvajal. Like there is travel elements in that. He definitely describes like New Leon and traveling with his brother, and like he refers to traveling across the Atlantic, and there he meets that Mateo who kind of influences him with Judaism. So yeah, I think that counts as travel literature totally, and that would be written in Spanish. So that's a good example, but of course in secret in tiny little script. So yeah, I do think that the other travel I can think of that kind of comes up with the Inquisition period, the Converso crisis. 15th century is Prophet Oran, Ephodi, who in Jewish tradition is called Ephodi. He was a great scholar in early 15th century Spain, and he did convert to Catholicism during the Converso crisis, but he took the name Honoratus bona fide. So like he's honorable and bona fide, as if to say he is not a real Catholic. Okay, if anyone says I'm an honorable and bona fide guy, they're probably the opposite, right? So he's honoratus bona fide, that's what he calls himself, and he writes this really cool text. Al kika avatecha, al kikamo avatecha, master kaze, like something like don't be like your don't be like your fathers who had the truth of God from Mount Sinai. Don't be like your fathers who had the truth of all religion. Be a Catholic. So he writes this critical literature in Hebrew to conversos, and then he picks up and he migrates himself. So he's one of the interesting cases of migration to I guess at that point Ottoman Palestine that is connected to the converso crisis. And then Luis de Carvajal is a good example. I wouldn't have thought of that because he's a converso. It's hard to but that's an interesting example. Yeah. Thank you all very much.